The year 2024 saw a dramatic escalation in the Somali insurgency, fueled by a confluence of internal and external factors. The most significant of these was the influx of weapons into the country. Egypt, in a move that sent shockwaves across the region, shipped large quantities of arms to Somalia. These were not mere small arms or ammunition. Cairo sent heavy weaponry, anti-aircraft guns, artillery pieces, the tools of a modern military. Egypt's actions were driven by a complex web of regional power dynamics. The intended recipient of this military aid was the Somali government, engaged in a protracted struggle against the Islamist insurgency of al-Shabaab. However, the arrival of these weapons had unintended consequences, exacerbating existing tensions and creating new ones. The most immediate and dangerous consequence was the reaction of Ethiopia. Ethiopia, with its own long and volatile history with Somalia, viewed the Egyptian arms shipments with profound suspicion. Ethiopian officials saw the move as a direct threat to their own national security, a move designed to bolster Somali capabilities at Ethiopia's expense. In response, Ethiopia embarked on its own military buildup. Troops were massed along the Somali border, a clear signal to Mogadishu and Cairo that Addis Ababa would not stand idly by. The Ethiopian government also moved aggressively to secure its interests within Somalia itself, seizing control of several key airports in Somali regions bordering Ethiopia. The influx of Egyptian weaponry into Somalia had a deeply unsettling secondary effect: the risk of al-Shabaab, the very group the Somali government is fighting, getting its hands on these arms. Al-Shabaab, despite years of counterinsurgency operations against it, remained a potent and dangerous force. It had a demonstrated ability to exploit chaos and instability, and the escalating tensions between Somalia and Ethiopia, coupled with the flood of new weapons, created an ideal environment for the group to thrive. Experts and analysts warned of the very real possibility that al-Shabaab could acquire these weapons, either through direct attacks on government stockpiles or, perhaps more likely, through corruption within the Somali military itself. Al-Shabaab had a long and well-documented history of obtaining arms on the black market, and there were deep concerns that corrupt Somali officials, motivated by personal gain, would be willing to sell weapons to the highest bidder. The potential consequences of al-Shabaab acquiring advanced weaponry were dire. The group, already capable of carrying out deadly attacks, would pose an even greater threat to the Somali government, the Somali people, and the region as a whole. The prospect of al-Shabaab obtaining anti-aircraft systems, for example, sent chills down the spines of security officials across East Africa. The fear was not merely that al-Shabaab would use these weapons to attack Somali or Ethiopian forces. The group, with its ties to other extremist organizations, could potentially smuggle these weapons out of Somalia into the hands of like-minded groups across the continent and beyond. The influx of Egyptian weapons into Somalia, while intended to strengthen the Somali government, had the very real potential to empower the very forces it was meant to combat. The Somali government, facing a reinvigorated insurgency and a volatile regional landscape, found itself struggling to maintain control. Years of conflict had taken a devastating toll on the country's institutions, leaving them weak, fractured, and plagued by corruption. These internal weaknesses were further exacerbated by external pressures, as regional powers jostled for influence and the threat of al-Shabaab loomed large. In an effort to bolster its military capabilities, the Somali government took the drastic step of lifting a partial arms embargo that had been in place for decades. This decision, while perhaps understandable in the face of mounting security threats, was not without risk. It opened the floodgates to even more weapons pouring into the country, weapons that could easily end up in the wrong hands. The Somali National Army, tasked with combating al-Shabaab and securing the country, was itself hampered by a range of challenges. Clan infighting, a persistent problem in Somalia, continued to divide the security forces, undermining their effectiveness. Corruption, deeply entrenched within the military and the government as a whole, siphoned away resources and eroded morale. These challenges were most clearly illustrated by the fate of the US-trained Danab Special Forces unit. Considered to be one of the most capable and effective units within the SNA, the Danab was dealt a severe blow by a corruption scandal involving the diversion of US food aid. The scandal led to the suspension of US aid and the withdrawal of Danab forces from the front lines, allowing al-Shabaab to regain territory. The escalating crisis in Somalia did not go unnoticed by the international community. The United States, despite the suspension of aid following the Danab corruption scandal, continued to provide some support to the Somali government, including the delivery of military vehicles. However, this support was limited, and there was a sense that the international community was hesitant to become too deeply involved in the conflict. The situation in Somalia in 2024 presented a complex and troubling picture. The influx of weapons, while intended to strengthen the Somali government, had the unintended consequence of exacerbating regional tensions and increasing the risk of al-Shabaab acquiring advanced weaponry. The Somali government, grappling with internal weaknesses and external pressures, found itself struggling to maintain control. The international community, while providing some support, appeared reluctant to become too deeply engaged. As the year drew to a close, the situation in Somalia remained precarious. The country teetered on the brink, its fate hanging in the balance. The outcome of the conflict would have profound implications not only for Somalia itself, but for the entire Horn of Africa region. The world watched and waited, hoping for a resolution to the crisis, but bracing for the possibility of further violence and instability.